Thank you for downloading this Great Lives podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information and details of other podcasts, just visit bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
In February 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry, who was mad, called in at the Albemarle Club in London and left a card. It's difficult to be precise about what he scrawled. The Marquis's writing was not of the best, but we think it reads, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." The consequences for Wilde were immense. Trials, prison, exile, disgrace. More of that in a while. My guest, who's chosen Oscar Wilde today, was once described as a high-powered satirical weapon in a New York Times book review. He's an author who has said that he writes in order to astonish, and who was famously fired from The Observer while covering John Major's 1997 election campaign. Perhaps more of that in a while. His books include Walking to Hollywood, Cock and Bull, and The Book of Dave, while his collection of short stories, Tough, Tough Toys for Tough, Tough Boys, won the Aga Khan Prize for Fiction. He is Will Self. Why, Will, have you chosen Oscar Wilde?
I'm a fan of the writing. I have some misgivings about the life, which doubtless we'll get to. But I think most of all I chose him in a way because I think that Richard Ellmann's biography of Wilde is probably the finest work of literary biography that's ever been written. And I think that of all the figures I've read about, I feel closest to Wilde in a emotional way.
I was pleased about this choice because he is a life as well as an oeuvre. He said himself that he said, "I put my genius into my life and my talent into my work." You can't separate him from the life, can you?
You can't separate him. In De Profundis, this astonishing kind of part mea culpa, part reviling of the hypocrisy of English society, part confessional that he wrote in prison after losing his libel case against the Marquis of Queensberry. He said that, quite unashamedly, he said, the point about me is that I'm one of those rare men whose life embodies the spirit of the age. And there's very few people who would dare to say that and for it to be true.
You've written this, Will. You think the big man, as you put it, was guilty of an overweening pride and arguably by bringing to public attention a social development that was happening inexorably, set back the cause of homosexual liberation in Britain by half a century. Now, without going into too much detail about the trial, which we'll come to, what do you mean by that?
I was perhaps shooting from the hip on that one, perhaps an apposite phrase. I think, it was said that on the night of Wilde's conviction, 600 single gentlemen crossed on the Calais packet to France. So there was this enormous exodus of...
Must have been quite a crossing.
...of gay men to the continent in the wake of this. But you have to bear in mind that the actual offence of consenting to homosexual activities in private had been made an offence the year before.
Yes,
so there was a climate of repression already going around. But as the standard bearer, and he had been the standard bearer in this peculiar act of social and cultural doubling that he was involved in really for 15 or 20 years, he was the focus, the cynosure of a kind of openly gay movement in England at the time. And I think his pride and his arrogance in taking on the Marquis of Queensberry...
Aggression.
Yeah, I mean, everybody around him pleaded with him to flee, which was the established thing to do. It was done a lot. I think had he fled... I think those 600 gentlemen wouldn't have needed to go to the continent. I think that it was quite possible that the fact of him having to flee alone would have dampened down, cooled down the somewhat hothouse atmosphere surrounding openly gay expressions, both cultural and artistic at the time. And it's quite possible that the cause of homosexual liberation might have been rather smoother in this country than it in fact turned out to be.
Also with us is Franny Moyle, author of Constance, the tragic and scandalous life of Mrs. Oscar Wilde. Some listeners might be surprised to hear that Wilde had a wife. Is that why you wrote the book, Franny?
Yes, I think it probably is, in a nutshell. She was equally a victim of the time because she suffered... She didn't go to jail, but she was forced into exile with their 2 children.
It's a really sad story.
It's
I've read the
terrible
book.
story. And so she was punished as badly, I think. By modern standards, the treatment of these people by society is intolerable, inexcusable.
Did the marriage start as a real marriage? What was Wilde's sexuality, would you say?
Well, I think very much it did start as a real marriage. And Oscar had a lot of girlfriends, and that's pretty well recorded. And one of his very early girlfriends was Florrie Balcombe, who went on to become Mrs. Bram Stoker, for example. Women liked him, and he liked women.
But, the thing about homosexuality in the late Victorian period is that there was so much hypocrisy in so much sexual conduct. The streets of London were thronged with prostitutes. I think Ellman says in his biography that, Wilde's attitude towards the renters, in inverted commas, in other words, the prostitutes that he frequented and that were the essence of his downfall, was that of any man towards any prostitute, you see. So it was of a piece in that way. Not very nice, if you like.
Not very nice,
No.
and a life, as Franny said, overlaid with tragedy. Maybe best summed up in the letter Wilde wrote from Reading Gaol to his lover Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, the Marquess of Queensberry's son. The letter was published as De Profundis, from the depths, and here's Simon Russell Beale reading from it.
I amuse myself with being a flaneur, a dandy, a man of fashion. I surrounded myself with smaller natures and meaner minds. I became the spendthrift of my own genius. Tired of being on the heights, I deliberately went to the depths in the search for new sensations. What the paradox was to me in the sphere of thought, perversity became to me in the sphere of passion. Desire at the end was a malady or a madness, or both. I grew careless of the lives of others. I took pleasure where it pleased me and passed on. I forgot that every little action of the common day makes or unmakes character. I ceased to be lord over myself. I was no longer captain of my soul, and did not know it. I allowed you to dominate me, and your father to frighten me. I ended in horrible disgrace.
Let's run quickly through some of the details of his life. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde was born in 1854. Franny, tell us a little bit about his parents and his background.
Well, I suppose you would say his father was something of a self-made man, in that, his father was a very eminent eye surgeon who had kind of made his own way.
And sexually quite wayward himself. He entered the marriage with 3 illegitimate children.
A complete character, clearly with an enormous sex drive. I think, that's something he and Oscar completely shared, because we know of 3 illegitimate children, but of course there was a 4th claimed in a very scandalous court case that went public, something that foreshadows Oscar's own demise. In a very spooky way, his father was taken to court by a woman who claimed effectively that he'd raped her, and the shame of that really destroyed his father's career. He sort of retreated.
His mother, Speranza, as she called herself, was an Irish patriot and a nationalist, and this is at a time when Protestants and Catholics in the South are forging the modern nationalist movement, but at the same time Speranza ends up on a civil list or a Royal Literary Fund pensions. William Wilde is knighted. I think he was oculist to the
Queen Victoria.
To Queen Victoria. So you have here a strange doubling of opposition to the British state and yet co-option by it.
And a desire for acceptance, because she was fascinated by society and acceptance. And I think Oscar, if you can inherit that kind of traits, that he certainly did.
I'm trying to form a mental picture of the young Oscar at Trinity, Dublin, where he decided to be, in a fairly extravagant way, an aesthete.
I think the dandyism is there very, very early on, and when he gets to Trinity, Dublin, he's almost immediately in conflict with his dons and his tutors over his dandiacal carryings-on.
Here's Lily Langtry talking about him. Oscar had longish hair and wore an outfit that spoke of bohemian credentials: light-coloured trousers, a black frock coat, brightly coloured waistcoats with a white silk cravat held with an amethyst pin, and always carrying lavender gloves.